I can still taste the garum they served us that last morning in Eberacum. Salt and fish fermented into something that stuck to the back of your throat. It was March in the year 117 AD, and I was 23 years old, an auxiliary scribe assigned to the 9th Legion Hispana. 5,000 men garrisoned in a fortress of stone and timber that smelled like wet wool and coal smoke. I had joined them only 2 months before, transferred from a quiet posting in Londinium, where my duties involved counting grain shipments and updating tax records. I thought the 9th would be the same work, only colder. The fortress sat on high ground above the river. From the Principia, you could see the Vale of York stretching south, flat and tamed, roads cutting straight through farmland that paid tribute to Rome. To the north, the land changed. Hills rose in dark waves, and beyond them, mountains no legion had ever held. The men called it Caledonia. The locals who traded at our gates called it something else in their language, a word that sounded like wind through a narrow gap. Our legate was a career officer named Lucius Aemilius Carus, a man with a rigid spine and eyes that never showed doubt. He assembled the legion in the Forum 2 days before we marched. He told us the emperor required pacification of the northern frontier. He said tribes there had been raiding settlements, burning grain stores, killing tax collectors. He said we would march, engage, and return before summer. He said it the way a man states facts he has confirmed through documents and dispatch riders. I stood in formation with the other clerks and watched 5,000 men receive their orders in perfect silence. Not one of them knew they were being counted for the last time. We crossed beyond the wall on a morning thick with mist. The wall itself was unfinished then, just scattered foundations and timber palisades marking where Hadrian wanted his permanent barrier to stand. Our column stretched for nearly a mile, infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, supply wagons grinding along rutted tracks that passed for roads in that country. I rode with the baggage train, my writing materials packed in waxed leather to keep the damp out. The land changed within the first day's march. South of the wall, Britannia had the look of a province that understood Rome. Fields laid out in proper divisions, settlements built on grid patterns, roads that went where they were supposed to go. North of the wall, the earth seemed to resist geometry. Valleys curved in ways that made no tactical sense. Forests grew dense and tangled, not the managed woodland of the south. The hills rose steep and sudden, covered in heather that showed purple even in early spring. We passed through 3 villages in the first week, all of them empty. Not abandoned in panic, but carefully emptied. Cooking fires were cold, but not old, perhaps a day or 2. Grain stores had been moved, not burned. Livestock were gone. The building stood intact with doors left open, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away and intended to return. Our scouts found no tracks leaving in any organized direction. It was as though entire communities had evaporated into the surrounding landscape. The men began to feel it by the second week, a heaviness that settled over the column during the day's march. We were being watched. Every man knew it, but no enemy showed themselves. No arrows from the tree line, no ambush in the narrow passes, no night raids on our camps. Only silence and the sense of eyes tracking our movement through that gray country. The forest dominated the western approaches, old growth that our engineers said would take weeks to clear for a proper road. Trees stood so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. The air underneath smelled of moss and standing water. When we made camp near the forest edge, the sentries reported hearing movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. Rustling, footsteps, the occasional crack of a branch. But when they threw torches into the trees or sent out patrols, they found nothing, not even animal tracks. On the 15th day of March, we captured a Pict, He was young, perhaps 17, with blue marks on his face and arms that were not paint but seemed driven into the skin itself. He carried no weapons. Our cavalry found him standing alone on a ridgeline, watching our column pass below. He did not run when they approached. He did not speak when they brought him to the legate. He only watched us with black eyes that showed no fear at all. The first cairn appeared on the 18th morning, a pile of stones stacked waist-high beside the track we had marched the day before. Our scouts had passed that spot at dawn and reported nothing. By the time the vanguard reached it 2 hours later, the cairn stood there as if it had always existed. The stones were river rock, smooth and dark, arranged with care. No mortar, just balanced weight. At the top sat a flat stone with a symbol carved into its surface, a circle with lines radiating outward like a crude sun. Legate Caros ordered it knocked down and the column moved on. By evening camp, another cairn stood at our perimeter. Same height, same stones, different symbol. This one showed 3 crescents interlocked. The sentries swore on their gods that no one had approached the camp. The ground around the cairn showed no footprints, though the earth was soft from recent rain. I was ordered to document each cairn we found. By the end of the second week in Caledonian territory, I had sketched 17 different symbols. The cairns appeared ahead of us, behind us, sometimes to our flanks on high ground where we had posted no observers. They seemed to mark our progress through the mountains like milestones on a Roman road, except these counted something else. I noticed the stones in each cairn matched our numbers in strange ways. 17 cairns for 17 centuries, stones stacked in groups that corresponded to our cavalry divisions. The Pictish prisoner watched each new cairn with an expression I could not read. He remained silent, refusing food for 3 days before accepting water. The legate kept him bound but unharmed, hoping he might eventually speak. Instead, the Pict only observed. When we passed the cairns, his eyes would follow them until they disappeared from view. On the 21st day, a patrol returned at dusk and reported finding marks on trees along the northern ridge. I accompanied the Optio to see them. Deep cuts in the bark, fresh enough that sap still wept from the wounds. The cuts formed patterns, vertical lines in groups, slash marks, circles, counting marks. I recognized the system because it resembled how our quartermasters tallied supplies. These marks tallied us. Centuries, cohorts, cavalry units, all recorded in the wood with brutal accuracy. That night, 3 men vanished from the western watchpost. They had reported in at the 2nd hour after dark, voices clear and routine. At the 3rd hour, the relief patrol found the post empty. The men's gladi lay on the ground beside the fire. I touched one of the blades when they brought it back to camp. The metal was still warm from a hand that had held it moments before. We entered the valley on the 24th day of March. The legate chose it because maps suggested it led north toward the coastal settlements we were meant to pacify. The valley floor was wide enough for the column to maintain formation, with a stream running down its center that provided fresh water. On both sides, steep slopes rose covered in pine and bracken. At the valley's far end, perhaps 2 miles distant, stood a cluster of standing stones, tall shapes that broke the horizon line. The sound changed as soon as we descended into the valley. Our commands, shouted down the column, came back wrong. A centurion would call for halt, and the echo would return as fragments. "Halt! Ha! Halt!" But in reverse order, the last syllable arriving first. Footsteps from our own men seemed to come from the slopes above us, as though phantom sentries marched parallel to our position. I heard my own name called 3 times that first afternoon, each time from a different direction, though no one admitted to calling it. The engineers advised against camping near the standing stones, but the legate overruled them. He wanted high ground, and the stones occupied the only rise in the valley floor. We made camp in their shadow as the sun dropped behind the western slope. The stones themselves were ancient, older than Rome, older perhaps than any civilization we knew. They stood in a rough circle, each one twice the height of a man, covered in weathered carvings that might have been symbols or might have been the work of wind and rain across centuries. The Pictish prisoner became agitated for the first time since his capture. He pulled against his bonds and made sounds in his throat, not words, but something closer to warnings. The guard struck him once to silence him, but his eyes remained fixed on the stones and his breathing came in short, panicked bursts. Sentries were posted in double strength that night. I remained awake in my tent, updating the daily records by lamplight. Around the third watch, the reports began coming in. Guards on the eastern perimeter claimed to see movement beyond the firelight. Not individual figures, but formations. Entire centuries marching in the darkness, maintaining perfect Roman discipline, standards visible against the night sky. When the sentries called out challenges, the formations would stop. When our men stopped moving, the Phantom Legion stopped as well. Perfect mirror movements, always just beyond the range of torchlight. At dawn, I walked the perimeter and saw what the sentries had seen. Footprints in the dew-wet grass beyond our camp, thousands of them arranged in the precise pattern of a Roman legion on the march. The prints led to the standing stones and simply ended, as though an entire army had walked into the earth and vanished. The fog came down from the northern mountains 3 days after we left the Valley of Stones. It moved against the wind, rolling toward us in a thick wall while the breeze blew southward at our backs. I watched it approach from my position near the supply wagons and felt my skin go cold. Fog does not move that way. Fog does not advance with purpose. The legate ordered the column to tighten formation. Sentries closed ranks, cavalry pulled in from the flanks, wagons were positioned in the center. We continued marching as the fog enveloped us. Visibility dropped to arm's length within moments. The man beside me became a gray shape, then a shadow, then nothing but the sound of his breathing and the scrape of his boots on stone. Commands were shouted to maintain contact between units. Each centurion called out his position, and the responses came back muffled and distant. I heard the 3rd century report from what should have been 30 paces ahead. Their voices sounded like they were calling from across a vast field. The 7th century called from the rear, but their shouts seemed to come from above us, as though they marched on ground higher than ours, though the terrain was flat. The fog had texture inside it, not moisture exactly, but a thickness that made breathing feel like drawing air through wool. My eyes watered. My lungs worked harder with each breath. The temperature dropped until I could see my exhalations as white clouds that dissolved immediately into the surrounding gray. Men began coughing. I heard someone to my left stumble and curse, his voice swallowed almost before the words left his mouth. We marched for what felt like hours. No sun penetrated the fog to mark time. The officers called halt periodically to recount the units and ensure cohesion. Each count took longer than the last. Voices calling out numbers in the gray, waiting for responses that sometimes came late or not at all. When the fog lifted, it did so suddenly. One moment we moved through absolute gray, the next we stood in clear morning air under a pale sky. The legate immediately ordered a full accounting. The count came back short. 2 full centuries were missing. The 2nd and the 8th, 160 men simply gone. We searched the surrounding area for 3 hours. No tracks leading away from where the column had marched. No signs of struggle or ambush. No bodies, no blood, no equipment scattered on the ground. Only their standards, both of them planted upright in the earth in a perfect circle exactly 100 paces from where the column had halted. The wooden shafts were planted deep, driven into the ground with force that would have required tools we had not heard used. I approached one of the standards and found marks on the shaft. blue pigment still wet in patterns that matched the symbols on the standing stones. The legate ordered fortifications built immediately. We were deep in hostile territory now, our numbers reduced, and the men's faces showed a fear that discipline could no longer fully conceal. The engineers laid out a marching camp in the traditional manner. Rectangular perimeter, ditch and rampart, gates at the cardinal points. We worked through the afternoon digging earth that smelled of peat and old iron. The Pictish prisoner was found dead during the construction. He lay in the center of the supply area where he had been kept bound to a wagon wheel. His bonds were intact, the knots undisturbed, but his body had been arranged in a position no living man could achieve. His arms were folded across his chest, his legs crossed at the ankles, his head turned at an angle that would have snapped the neck. Blue paint covered his face in patterns that had not been there that morning. His eyes were open, staring upward, and showed no fear. Only a strange calm, as though he had expected this and welcomed it. The camp surgeon examined the body and could not determine cause of death. No wounds, no bruising, no signs of poison or suffocation. The man had simply stopped living, and something had arranged him afterward with care that suggested ritual purpose. The legate ordered the body burned immediately, but the men who carried it to the pyre reported that it felt wrong in their hands. Too light, they said, as though hollowed out from within. We finished the fortifications by dusk and posted triple watch on all walls. Fires were built every 10 paces along the rampart, enough light to see any approach. The men settled into their tents with weapons close. I sat in the praetorium tent with other clerks, updating casualty lists and supply inventories by lamplight, trying to maintain normal routine in circumstances that had become anything but normal. The sound began 2 hours after full dark, footsteps in the forest surrounding our camp. Not the random movement of animals or the cautious approach of scouts. These were disciplined steps, thousands of them moving in formation. The rhythm was unmistakable, the measured pace of infantry on the march. Left, right, endless and surrounding us on all sides. The sentries stared into the darkness beyond the firelight. Some called out challenges, others simply stood frozen, listening to an army circle our position in the black forest. The sound never stopped, never varied in tempo, never came closer or moved away. It simply continued, hour after hour, like a millstone grinding in the dark. I climbed the rampart near the northern gate and listened. The footsteps had no source I could identify. When torches were thrown into the trees, the light showed nothing but empty forest floor, bare earth and fallen pine needles. Yet the moment the torch guttered out, the footsteps resumed as though they had never ceased. Dawn came with silence more oppressive than the night's phantom march. The footsteps had stopped precisely at first light, cut off as suddenly as if a door had closed. We conducted morning roll call in the gray pre-dawn, and the count came back impossible. An entire century was missing from the camp's center, men who had bedded down in tents surrounded by other units on all sides. 80 men, gone. Their tents stood undisturbed, bedrolls still warm to the touch, weapons stacked neatly outside in regulation order. Not one man in the surrounding sentries had heard anything unusual during the night. The officers convened in the praetorium. I stood near the entrance recording their debate. Tribune Severus argued for immediate withdrawal south. Prefect Gaius insisted we hold position and wait for reinforcements that were never coming. The legate sat silent, his face gray, age showing in lines that had not been there a month before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its former certainty. He gave orders to prepare for a forced march at noon, direction to be determined. That morning, men began seeing double. A soldier would report to his centurion, receive orders, then walk away. Minutes later, the same soldier would approach again as if the first encounter had never occurred. The centurion would give the same orders and the soldier would leave again, nodding. Some men appeared in multiple locations simultaneously. I watched my tent companion, a clerk named Marcus, walk past the supply depot heading east. Moments later, I saw Marcus approach from the west, coming from the direction he should have already passed. When I called to him about it, he looked at me with confusion and said he had been in his tent all morning. The doublings increased as the day wore on. Soldiers reported receiving contradictory orders from the same officer minutes apart. Sentries saw relief guards approaching the walls, then watched the same guards approach again from a different gate. I witnessed my own Optio walk through a tent wall as though it were mist, his face blank, his movements mechanical. When I found him later at the command post, he had no memory of leaving it. Panic spread like sickness through the remaining legion. Men refused to separate from their tent groups, afraid that isolation meant disappearance. The legate abandoned the planned noon departure and ordered an immediate march. Formation dissolved into desperate movement. We struck camp in chaos, leaving equipment behind, breaking protocol that had been drilled into us for years. The forced march began in early afternoon, 4,000 men moving south with speed born of terror. We had no scouts ahead, no cavalry screen. We simply moved, trying to put distance between ourselves and that cursed ground. I marched with the clerks near the center, watching men around me, trying to verify that each one was real and singular. We reached the wall with fewer than 50 men. I cannot account for how the rest disappeared. They were simply not there when we counted ourselves at the gates. No final battle, no screaming retreat, just a gradual subtraction that occurred while we marched. Men would be walking in formation, and then gaps would appear in the lines. The rear guard was never seen again after the first day of retreat. They were behind us at dawn, gone by noon, and no one could say when exactly they had ceased to exist. The garrison commander at the wall listened to our report with a face that showed no expression. He provided food, water, and beds. The legate made his official account the following morning. I was present when he dictated it to the fortress scribes. He reported that the 9th Legion was being transferred to Germania to reinforce the eastern frontier. He stated that the northern campaign had achieved its objectives and pacification was complete. He mentioned no disappearances, no cairns, no fog that moved against wind. His voice was steady, and his words were lies that would become official record. 3 days later, I received my discharge papers. I had not requested them. None of the survivors had. They were simply issued to all of us with orders to disperse to different provinces. The legate looked at me once before I left and said nothing. His eyes were empty in a way I had never seen in a living man. I took my discharge pay and traveled to a coastal settlement in the south, a village built on chalk cliffs above the sea where no forests grew and the land lay open under wide sky. I found work keeping accounts for a merchant who traded in pottery and dyed wool. Simple numbers, clean transactions, nothing that required me to count men who might not be there when I looked again. I never spoke of Caledonia. When other veterans asked where I had served, I told them Londinium, garrison duty, nothing remarkable. The official records show the 9th transferred to Germania, then to Judea, then scattered across the empire in reassignments that make no tactical sense. Historians will debate what happened to 5,000 men. They will propose Germanic campaigns, eastern deployments, gradual attrition across multiple fronts. I know what I saw. I know what walked in those mountains. The 9th Legion's final fortress at Iberacum shows signs of sudden abandonment. Equipment left mid-repair, personal items unclaimed, records that simply stop. The Highlands reveal nothing. No mass graves, no battlefield, no archaeological evidence of catastrophe. Some ground cannot be conquered because it is already held by those who understand it better than any empire ever could. The Caledonii did not defeat us with superior numbers or tactics. They made us forget we had ever marched north at all. And in forgetting, we ceased to exist in any record that mattered. I am 80 years old now. I still will not walk near forests after dark.